welcome to Power Play. I'm Michael Couture. Vashi Kapelos is on assignment today. Tonight, Prime Minister Carney won't rule out Canadian participation in Iran.
One can never categorically rule out participation. We will stand by our allies if it makes sense.
Carney says that Canada will defend allies when it makes sense. Well, he said our military's involvement in the conflict is hypothetical. He also didn't rule it out. So what could Canada contribute? We'll ask former Royal Canadian Navy Commander Mark Norman and one of Canada's last representatives in Iran, Denis Horak. Then, evolving messaging. Our front bench will be here to talk about Prime Minister Carney's position when it comes to that war. Also, Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc is headed to Washington tomorrow. We're going to break it all down with Christy Clark, Tony Clement, Marco Mendicino, and Monty Solberg. Plus, new polling numbers give the Liberals a double-digit lead. Nick Nanos will join us to talk about his latest polling. And his numbers show the Liberals have now opened up an 11-point advantage over the Conservatives. He'll be here to unpack all of that just a little later on in the show. First, though,
the United States military, together with the wonderful Israeli partners, continues to totally demolish the enemy far ahead of schedule and at levels that people have never seen before, actually. We had really no choice. They were going to hit us if we didn't hit them because they're crazy. And in the long term, the actions we're taking will dramatically increase the stability of the region.
those are new comments coming into us from U.S. President Donald Trump just minutes ago, speaking about the war in Iran that has now expanded across much of the Middle East. Now, there's also been a shift in Canada's position on the conflict. When it started, Prime Minister Mark Carney supported the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Then, Carney said Canada arrived at that position with, quote, regret. However, last night, when asked if he would definitively say whether Canada would participate in the U.S. military action with Iran, Carney wouldn't rule it out, even though he called it a fundamental hypothetical. He added this country stands by its allies. Have a listen.
One can never categorically rule out participation. We will stand by our allies when it makes sense. There's a distinction between the offensive actions that were taken and are being taken by the United States and Israel, that were taken by them without consultation with Canada, with other allies, and we're not party to those actions. But we will always defend Canadians. We will always stand by and defend our allies.
Also today, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said the alliance will not activate its mutual defense clause after a missile was shot down near Turkey.
Well, Article 5, I think, is not in order here. Nobody's talking about Article 5. And the most important thing is that our adversaries have seen yesterday that NATO is so strong and so vigilant, and even more vigilant, if possible, since Saturday because of the situation, of course, in the Middle East. So they see and know and sense that our military are on this.
It all comes as U.S. President Donald Trump says the United States should play a role in choosing Iran's next supreme leader. So should Canada get involved in this conflict? And if that happens, what could our country contribute? And joining me now are Denis Horak. He was one of Canada's last representatives to Iran before we cut off diplomatic ties, serving as the chargé d'affaires from 2009 to 2012. Also with us today, retired Vice Admiral Mark Norman. He's the former commander of the Royal Canadian Navy. Thank you both for being here. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Mr. Norman, I want to start with you. As you heard, the Prime Minister said there that military participation in the Middle East in that war can't be ruled out, even though he called it a fundamental hypothetical. But if we did participate, I wanted to know what capabilities Canada can contribute here.
Well, it's pretty slim pickings, to be honest. I think it would really depend on the circumstance. Probably some, and it depends on when the participation may be wanted. We do have long established relationships through our special forces with the Kurds. So depending on how the U.S. administration imagines the Kurds playing in this long term, that's unclear. I don't know what kind of stabilization force or anything like that they might imagine. So, to be blunt, Mike, without getting into specifics, I think the Prime Minister's response is entirely appropriate because there's just too many unknowns and too many variables between now and that kind of conversation taking place. Plus, I would add that the administration in Washington is probably not doing themselves any favors when they make public statements to the effect that now that they're working with Israel, they have allies they can rely upon. That certainly doesn't send a great sense of enthusiasm or warm welcome to those traditional allies that have been completely cut out of this process.
Mr. Horak, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the message that we seem to see shifting from the Prime Minister. On Saturday, he said he supported the airstrikes on Iran, but he's since kind of shifted away from that full-throated support. How do you read the government's position as it is right now?
I think it's just adding a little bit of nuance to it. I don't think that the support for the campaign has been discarded. I think it's probably been caveated about, and from what I've seen, caveated about the conduct of the war, how it's conducted, making sure it falls within the guidelines of international law. Also, putting, I guess, a marker out there that they don't want this to be a long-term venture. So I think trying to straddle the fence a little bit is smart politics, I think, and that's kind of where it's coming from, I think.
Do you think, Mr. Horak, that is because Canada is also trying to expand trade in the region and making sure that they aren't getting too involved on either side of this right now?
I don't think so. I don't think that's a factor into it at this point. I think the support that Canada's had for it from the beginning was based on an alignment of concerns with the U.S. with regards to Iran, the bilateral relationship, and somewhat of the local politics in Canada with regards to the Iranian-Canadian community. The Gulf states, other countries in the region, their reactions are a reflection of what's happening in the war. They were perhaps a bit neutral or a little lukewarm at the start. Once they became targets, then all bets are off for them. So I really don't think our trade concerns in the region were a factor in this whatsoever.
Mr. Norman, in the 2003 Iraq War, Canada did deploy naval assets to help the Americans with patrols. Do you think that Canada could be doing that again, especially when you consider the extreme focus that we're seeing on the Strait of Hormuz right now and the fact that that continues to be a choke point? Do you think that that's where Canada can help at all?
Well, it's certainly an option. We have ships deployed at the moment with NATO. They could be chopped, as we would say, to a broader coalition effort, if that's something that was actually being discussed. I don't imagine us doing anything bilaterally with the United States. I also am struggling to imagine a scenario in the current context where the United States would be asking directly. So I think this is kind of a wait and see scenario. I think, to be honest, it would be less about material contributions than it would be about the United States shifting its strategy to bring in a broader coalition of supporting countries. Mm-hmm. And at the moment, we're not seeing any indications of that being their thinking. I think if they did do that, it would probably be a reflection of the fact that what they're imagining today has not necessarily gone the way they thought it would.
To that end, Mr. Norman, in the last 24 hours, we've seen the U.S. step up its pursuit of the Iranian Navy, sinking one of their warships with a torpedo off the southern coast of Sri Lanka. I wanted to get your take on that, given that it happened hundreds of kilometers from the Persian Gulf.
Yeah, so clearly they've identified a number of priority objectives with respect to neutralizing or at least, reducing and mitigating the possibility of the Iranian forces being used. The Navy is important in the sense that it is one of the mechanisms that the Iranians can use to choke off the straits if that's one of the strategies they would pick in response to what's happened. The fact that they, I don't know whether they pursued the vessel or whether they were able to attack it using intelligence in the area. It's really irrelevant. The point is that if the Americans deem that to be a combatant in the context of this current conflict, then it's a legitimate target. I don't necessarily share the celebratory reporting of it, but I think all is fair in the context of the kind of conflict that we're seeing emerging here, recognizing that we're only 5 days into it at this point.
Mr. Horak, U.S. President Donald Trump said today that he wants to be involved in choosing Iran's next supreme leader. What could be the implications of that type of move in your mind?
I don't think it's at all possible, to be perfectly honest. The Iranians have a succession plan in place. They would have had one long before the war, and the supreme leader was 86 years old, so that was already in place. The U.S. will have no influence apart from perhaps taking out the next one and the next one, as they've talked about, and the Israelis have talked about as well. They're not going to be able to handpick. I'm not sure where President Trump is coming from on all of this. It doesn't sound like a particularly well thought out idea.
Just in closing, to both you gentlemen, Iran fired missiles that entered Turkey's airspace, or Turkey's airspace. NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte said the alliance isn't looking to trigger Article 5. But Mr. Horak, how worried are you that we're getting close to that moment?
I don't think we're there yet. But I do think that is the kind of scenario, perhaps, that the Prime Minister was talking about when he said we couldn't rule out Canadian involvement at some point down the road, hypothetically, because if NATO countries are drawn into this, if Turkey were to be subjected to a missile barrage, for example, that could trigger Article 5, and that would bring Canada in. So I think it's that sort of an eventuality that the Prime Minister was referring to. I was surprised that they would try and bring Turkey in, but again, the idea of the Iranians hitting all of these countries in the region is to spread the pain, increase the cost, and try and get them to pressure the U.S. and Israel to bring an end to this.
Mr. Norman, what is your sentiment on that and the feeling of where we are right now, even though, as you said, this is day 5 or 6?
Yeah, well, I agree completely with Dennis's assessment. And, that there's some desperation in this. Iran is the only one that benefits from broadening the implied or implicated countries in this conflict. The Americans would want to keep this as tight as they possibly can. It's somewhat desperate that the Iranians would try to do this, and I can understand why they would. But I think, cool heads will prevail, certainly in the capitals of NATO. NATO has no vested interest in this per se, and it would be unhelpful. And I think it would honestly create problems for the Americans, at least in the short term, with respect to how they would manage that. I think we have to see where this goes, and it's still unclear. Every time there's an announcement from Washington, we get some new variable in their apparent thinking. And to be honest, this is a military action that has no military end in terms of the goals that they appear to be achieving, other than destroying Iran's military capability, which in and of itself, although it might be useful, it doesn't really lead to anything constructive in the long term.
So then, Mr. Norman, I guess I have to ask, that 4-week timeline that President Trump had set, I'm assuming you're not seeing that.
No, I mean, it's arbitrary. It might have something to do with where they see themselves in terms of phasing the operation, but I don't see how you're going to get any significant outcome. And back to what Mr. Harg said earlier, with respect to just the leadership alone, the Iranians will be going through a whole series of internal processes to try and figure out, what their next steps look like. And I don't see the Iranians capitulating anytime soon. And so, to be honest, I think the Americans have opened up a real mess here. And I'm not sure what their plan is to either end it in their own interest or to at least come out of this with a constructive outcome. But it's early days still.
Okay. Unfortunately, gentlemen, I'm going to have to leave it on that note. Retired Vice Admiral Mark Norman, former commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, and Dennis Horak. He is one of Canada's last representatives to Iran before we cut off diplomatic ties. He also serves as a charge d'affaires from 2009 to 2012. Thank you both for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
And we've got some breaking news for you right now. We're going to take you to a press conference played for you on delay because it is already started. And it's Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense. He is giving an update on the latest with the conflict in the Middle East. And we're going to go to him right now in Doral, Florida. Let's have a listen. Okay, it doesn't seem like we have that tape just now, but we will be going to it in moments. Stand by for us. In the meantime, we do want to give you an update on Canadians who are in the Middle East right now and who are looking to come home. Yesterday morning, Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand had said that Canada was not currently offering any charter flights, but that has changed. Have a listen to what the minister said last night.
The situation is volatile and unpredictable. And if Canadians wish to leave, we are putting in place options for them to do so. And those options are tailored to the particular country and are based to some extent on whether that country has open airspace by which flights can leave the region.
Minister Anand says more than 106,000 Canadians and permanent residents have registered as being in the Middle East. Now, those people are spread across more than a dozen countries. Of those, more than 2,000 people have requested help to leave. Of those people, Anand says 85% are from just 5 countries. The majority of them are in the United Arab Emirates, where airspace right now is currently limited. Okay, we're going to take you now to that press conference being given by the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. Let's have a listen.
No shortage of American will here. We remember and honor our fallen, those 6 that we will soon welcome at Dover, who gave everything for their country in this mission. We remember them. But we remember them by rededicating ourselves even more fervently to this mission. Our commitment to our mission objectives only increases as our advantages continue to increase. We've got no shortage of munitions. Our stockpiles of defensive and offensive weapons allow us to sustain this campaign as long as we need to. Again, our munition status only increases as our advantage increases. Our capabilities, we have only just begun to fight and fight decisively. Having a chance to hear from Admiral Cooper. If you think you've seen something, just wait. The amount of combat power that's still flowing, that's still coming, that we'll be able to project over Iran is a multiples of what it currently is right now when you add up our capabilities and those of the Israeli Defense Forces. And we have no shortage of authorities. The Admiral knows we have clear objectives with maximum authorities on the battlefield. The dumb, politically correct wars of the past were the opposite of what we're doing here. They had vague objectives with restrictive, minimalist rules of engagement. No more. Our authorities, his authorities, CENTCOM's authorities through the President and myself are maxed out. Our capabilities are overwhelming and gathering still, as are those of our Israeli partners. Our munitions are full up, and our will is ironclad, which means our timeline is ours and ours alone to control. As long as it takes to ensure the United States of America achieves these objectives, and as we flow more forces, and as we flow more capabilities, and as our munitions, as we're flying over the top, have even more devastating effects, we set the tempo We set the timeline, led by the commander on the ground. Our ear is to the ground to listen to Admiral Cooper, what he needs, and what he needs he will get. We are built for this fight, and we are in it to win it. And we have the right commander in the lead. So I'll now hand it over to Admiral Brad Cooper to give you an update right here from CENTCOM. Admiral.
Mr. Secretary, first, thank you very much and good afternoon, and welcome to U.S. Central Command Headquarters, America's Warfighting Headquarters. It's great to be here alongside the Secretary and representing the more than...
That was some tape from earlier. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, is going to be taking questions. We're going to cue that up for you in just a moment. We're going to give you some other significant political news from south of the border, though, today. Kristi Noem is out as U.S. President Donald Trump's Secretary of Homeland Security. Now, her departure comes just 2 days after facing grilling on Capitol Hill from both Republicans and Democrats. Noem faced a tumultuous tenure overseeing ICE operations, which were met with protests across a number of cities. Okay, and there was also a Truth Social by Trump saying, talking about Noem, saying that she has, quote, served us well and has had numerous and spectacular results, especially on the border. He went on to say Noem will be moving to the new role of Special Envoy for the Shield of Americas. Oklahoma Senator Mark Wayne Mullen has been appointed as the new Secretary of Homeland Security. He'll take over that role following confirmation by the U.S. Senate. Okay, as promised, we're going to head back to that press conference right now in Doral, Florida. We believe it's Secretary Hegseth who is taking questions, as well as one of the military commanders. Let's have a listen in right now.
Absolutely. Right there, yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Secretary. President Trump, in his first speech after the launch of the Operation Epic Fury, he addressed Iranian people and he said that there's going to be a time for you to come out, but it's not now. Stay home. It's not safe. I want to know if there is a timeline for that you're going to urge Iranian people to come out, how that is going to play out, and how are you going to protect the protesters? You know that they're going to be shot probably, as we witnessed in January. That's what happened. How are you going to protect and support the protesters? And Admiral, I have one question for you. How are you going to minimize the civilian harms? We have a lot of evidence that the Basij units, IRGC commanders, they are now gathering in schools, in hospitals, in purely residential areas because their headquarters are bombarded, they are ruined, of course. So how are you going to protect the civilians while you're attacking the IRGC people hard? Thank you.
I would just say on the protests, obviously the Iranian people showed a lot of courage in those protests, and we saw the Iranian regime was revealed for what it is in the way they reacted to that. The world saw that. No one's done more than President Trump to reopen the opportunity for those who want a free Iran to do so. Ultimately, it's common sense, as he said up front. Don't go out and protest while bombs are dropping inside Tehran and elsewhere. So there will come a moment where he determines, or they determine, that it's the time to seize that advantage. But there's a lot of things we're doing and the Israeli military is doing, targeting those individuals who are targeting those who protest. The more you do that and you erode their will and you erode their capabilities, the more you create an opportunity for people to boldly stand up.
Yeah, I would just reinforce the point. We're targeting the people. We're targeting the headquarters and the people who are targeting the protesters, first and foremost. I'd also just double down on the president's comments that he previously made to the people. Stay in your homes, keep things calm, stay out of the way. There's a lot of U.S. and Israeli capacity coming over. We're hitting a lot of targets. The best thing for them to do for right now is just to lay low.
Right here.
One common outcome of American military action in the past has been taking in thousands of refugees into the American homeland, and I'm wondering if there's any safeguards put in place to make sure that the American people aren't having to have another wave of refugees from the Middle East or anywhere else come and stay here.
I think it's safe to say there's no plan for a wave of new Middle Eastern refugees to the United States of America. I think, as the president has pointed out for a long time, there are a lot of countries in the region who would be capable of providing that kind of support if need be, but that's certainly not something we're planning on. Yep, back there. Yep.
Yes, sir. Michael in Washington Times. I wanted to ask, I know, Semper Gumby is always a truism in the military. Did the British decision to refuse Diego Garcia have any impact on the mission itself? Did you have to adjust, or were you able to just completely, go with the mission without even worrying about that?
Well, as the president stated, it was unfortunate that that the Brits didn't, from day one, say, "Hey, go ahead and have access." But we got there. We got there, and that's now part of the way that we're operationalizing bomber runs. And that's part of when we say more to come, it's more fighter squadrons, it's more capabilities, it's more defensive capabilities, and it's more bomber pulses more frequently. The amount of firepower over Iran and over Tehran is about to surge dramatically. And part of it is that we're going to have even more basing. And it's not just the UK. We've had other friends step up, and we're grateful for that. Maybe one more right here.
Yeah.
All right, you are listening to U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. He is meeting with reporters in Doral, Florida, taking questions about the conflict in the Middle East. We're going to continue to monitor that. If any other developments come, we will bring them to you. And as that conflict in the Middle East escalates, Prime Minister Mark Carney says that Canada can't categorically rule out military participation. Now, those comments are getting a lot of reaction from the opposition today. Conservative defense critic James Bazan says there should be a parliamentary debate in the House of Commons before any type of military involvement. Prime Minister Carney's messaging has kind of evolved since the outset of the war. Carney started by backing the U.S. in their strikes on Iran, but later saying that Canada takes that position, quote, with regret. So why has there been this shift? Well, let's ask our front bench. With us today, our former BC Premier, Christy Clark. She's now Senior Advisor with Bennett Jones. Marco Mendicino is the former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Mark Carney and former Liberal Cabinet Minister. He's now Senior Counsel and Strategic Advisor for Castles. Tony Clement served in senior cabinet roles in the Conservative government led by Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He's now the CEO of Tony Clement International, and former federal Conservative Cabinet Minister and MP Monty Solberg. He is now the CEO of New West Public Affairs. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for sticking around through parts of that press conference with Pete Hegseth. Christy, I wanted to start with you. We know that this situation continues to evolve in the Middle East. So do you see this as the Prime Minister changing his message or just adjusting it?
I think events are moving very quickly, and I think everybody's trying to catch up to that. The challenge posed for Canada, I think, is this. We're in the middle of trade negotiations with the United States in a very difficult moment. And I can tell you that when other prime ministers have sat down with presidents in the United States, when there's been a requirement or a suggestion that Canada join a war effort, it has always been a very transactional discussion. So we shouldn't be sitting here thinking, well, should we or shouldn't we? Is it the right thing to do, just because of the war itself, although we should be. It will also be very much in the Prime Minister's mind how this is going to affect our overall relationship with the United States. Now, my view is, I do think that Canada should actively consider being a part of it. Iran has been the worst neighbor in history for everyone in the Middle East. Hezbollah, Hamas, Iraq, Syria, you name it. They've made a mess of the entire region, and they're forming very effective alliances with, people with whom we trade, like China, for example, but who nonetheless don't necessarily have our interests at heart. So it's one of those moments where you look at it as a country and you say, where do our interests lie here? There are very strong domestic interests, I would argue, but I think there's also responsibility to the neighborhood of the world and to the idea of the values and democratic values, the rights of individuals and societies that we also honor and would like to see replicated in more countries around the world rather than fewer. And that's, I think, the question for Parliament to consider and the Prime Minister to consider should he decide to convene the Parliament to discuss it.
Tony, what are some of the risks here? I mean, a lot of them as laid out there by Christie, but as he's pressed to take a position, and as this is continuing to evolve, how difficult is it for him to try and deliver an answer for Canadians and for reporters who are for asking those questions, but to make sure that he leaves himself that kind of wiggle room to be able to shift as the conflict continues to shift?
Well, to be honest, I'm getting whiplash observing the Prime Minister with his 3 or 4 different positions on this issue. I think Christy Clark's answer to your question was more concise and cogent and made more sense than what we've heard from the Prime Minister. Christy, kudos to you, but we're hearing, as you're saying, shifting points of view and shifting principles on this issue. So is he getting pressure from caucus members? Perhaps, although he's high in the polls right now. They should be giving him the benefit of the doubt rather than pressing in on something like this. But maybe that's the issue. It could be trying to do this balancing act between our relationship with Donald Trump in the United States versus the middle power philosophy of Mark Carney. But again, it's so bizarre. Just as he's moving away from his initial position, the middle powers like the UK and France are moving towards activity in the region. So it's all a big mess right now, I got to tell you.
Marco, you have served as his chief of staff. Do you think he's shifting principles as Tony is sort of laying it out there?
Well, I think he's adjusting, and what we've really put our finger on is just how volatile the situation is. What's causing the whiplash is the war and the conflict. We've been on this panel now for maybe a few minutes. We're now out of date as to what is happening on the ground. So I think we can allot, some understanding to the Prime Minister and the government as it tries to keep pace. But I want to come back to what Christy said, because I thought her intervention was important, and that is, what are Canada's interests as we take the decisions that we are taking to the extent that we are playing a role at all in the Middle East and this conflict. One, for certain, is to support our allies, and there's no doubt that the United States is a strategic and critical ally of ours. The second interest that we have is to defeat terror. And there is incontrovertible evidence that the Iranian regime's single greatest export is terror. So much so that it has killed Canadians, killed thousands of people in the region, and continues to be a challenge when it comes to foreign interference. That is the second interest. And the third interest is to ensure that all of the groundwork that the Prime Minister has been doing in the region with other strategic allies and emerging partners in the Gulf, all of those foreign direct investments which are going to help us increase our sovereign capabilities at home are protected, which is why it is important not to be definitive to the nth degree as the situation unfolds rapidly. Now, I will add one last thing. I agree that anytime Canada contributes the men and women that serve in uniform, that there needs to be a robust debate. And I'm confident that were we to have to take that decision, heaven forbid, that there would be such a debate on the floor of the House of Commons, which is where it belongs first and foremost, and elsewhere. But let's understand that the situation is rapidly evolving, it is volatile, and that is what is causing the whiplash. It is not just simply the words that are coming out of any one head of government.
Monty, how important is that consultation of Parliament? Because if I'm not mistaken, you were an MP the last time Canada was involved in this type of theater in Afghanistan.
It's important, but I just have to go back and respond to the comments of my colleagues. If Donald Trump is the taco, Mark Carney is the waffle. He's been all over on this issue. He didn't need to commit himself early on because he didn't know what the Americans were planning on doing, because the Americans didn't know what they were planning on doing. So he made, I think, a real tactical error off the top in not buying time until he had a good sense of what the Americans were planning on doing. I agree with my colleagues here who have underlined the importance of standing up to that terrorist regime in Iran, but we need to remember that there are various ways of doing that. There are various ways of engaging, and unfortunately, the Prime Minister has taken different positions at different times without really knowing what the Americans were attempting to do.
Okay, we have to take a quick commercial break. We're going to leave that debate right there for right now. When we come back, though, we're going to go to D.C. Well, not us. Dominic LeBlanc is going to D.C. The Canada-U.S. Trade Minister is going to be in the U.S. Capitol tomorrow for meetings with his American counterpart. And it comes as Prime Minister Mark Carney says that CUSMA is broken in the short term. Our front bench will be right back to talk about that after this.
The facts are we're in a position where Canada has a comprehensive free trade agreement with the United States. There's certain protocols under that agreement. If temporary tariffs or other tariffs are put in place, those have not been followed. So that agreement effectively has been broken in the short term by U.S. actions. That's a fact that would be acknowledged, I think, by all sides. Maybe slightly more diplomatic terms would be used, but that's the reality. That puts us in a position where we need to build on what we have in order to reestablish that trust commercially.
Prime Minister Mark Carney with some carefully chosen words there while talking to reporters about the Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement. He told them that because the U.S. imposed tariffs on Canada, protocols of the deal were not followed. So it's essentially fractured in the short term. Now, Carney says Canada is looking to this year's CUSMA review as a process to reestablish trust with businesses and investors. And last night, the U.S. Court of International Trade ruled businesses are owed refunds for U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs. It all comes as Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc is headed to Washington tomorrow to meet with his counterpart, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. LeBlanc's office says they'll discuss the CUSMA review as well as bilateral concerns. So what are the stakes for this meeting? Let's ask our front bench. With me now again, Christy Clark, Marco Mendicino, Tony Clement, and Monty Solberg. Christy, there's an old saying in show business, timing is everything. So what do you think of the timing of this meeting, even though it was set up last week?
I thought that was a saying from politics, but okay, we'll give it to you. Well, look, I have a lot of confidence in Dominic LeBlanc. I do think, he's a guy that just exudes warmth and, kind of the ability to talk people into things. Now, the Americans are pretty tough customers, but I think he's building or has built a strong relationship south of the border with folks that are negotiating, Jamieson Greer included, I think. So I think we're in good stead there. But the challenge is going to be, rules of origin, for example. How are we going to give some of that up? It's a solid argument, I think, that the Americans don't want to see China coming in the back door through Canada to access the free trade agreement advantages. But on the other hand, Canadians use a lot of Chinese steel for our manufacturing. How are we going to handle EV batteries and things like that? So there's all those issues, and then there's dairy and the other farm-related issues. And I think that that's going to be something that Canada ends up giving more to the Americans on. I just don't see how the supply managed system, despite the fact that it's worked for Canada for a long time, is going to survive this discussion. So there's going to be some give and take there. But I do think ultimately his goal, Dominic LeBlanc's goal right now, is to lower the temperature, to kind of get everything back to an even keel in the discussions and figure out what they're going to do on July 1st, kind of get a feel from the Americans about how things are going to roll once the required comprehensive review begins for 2026.
Monty, there's an aggravating factor in all of this, and on the USTR website earlier today, there was an announcement that the first round of bilateral discussions in preparation for the joint review of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement are starting with Mexico, adding that they're expected to hold their first meeting the week of March 16th. So how much pressure is on LeBlanc to get a similar statement out of his meeting tomorrow?
Well, there may be a certain amount of pressure, but I think the important thing for Dominic LeBlanc, who is a pro and is, very familiar with this sort of negotiation, is to take as much time as he possibly can so he doesn't rush into a position that Canadians later regret. We're in a situation where we have a very tight parliament. I think you want to know that parties have been consulted. This has all been discussed. And you take as much time as you possibly can to come to some kind of decisions on this, because frankly, time is the friend of Canada. It's not the friend of the Americans right now. They're running into midterm elections. They're starting to see politics bubble up on trade. So if Dom LeBlanc can stretch this out as much as possible, that can only work to the advantage of Canadians. But I also think it's just prudent to take your time and really weigh all the dynamics before you come back with any kind of answer to the Americans.
Marco, you're in a unique position. Not only have you been in the Oval Office, you've met some of the people that Dominic LeBlanc is set to meet there. Do you think, as Monty had said, that time is on our side and those people, Jamieson Greer, Howard Lutnick and the like, may be in a bit of a rush to try and make a deal, or is this going at their pace right now?
Well, I have met some of the principals on the other side of the negotiating table, and I do think it's important that we continue to exercise patience and composure, which is something that I think the Prime Minister and Dominic LeBlanc, who I obviously know as well, are very good at doing. I would add one other name into the mix, and that's Janice Charette, former clerk of the Privy Council and advisor to the Prime Minister, and now her new capacity as a chief negotiator. So you have an extremely formidable duo of Canadians who are there on the front lines to do as Christy said, which I think is to try to, get things back on track. Now, I would expand that a little bit and get to what I think our fundamental trade objectives are, which is to get the tariff down to as low as possible, to preserve as much of the CUSMA exemptions, particularly for those sectors of the economy that are vital to our GDP, while addressing that sort of host or that suite of grievances which have sort of interfered with the smooth running of the bilateral trade relationship for some time. And again, they've been itemized. In the meantime, I do think it is important to observe that the president's own case for tariffs has weakened over time. It's weakened in the courts, where the IEEPA tariffs, the fentanyl tariffs, were struck down, and now the courts are taking the next step of ordering the government to refund those tariffs. It has weakened in the House of Representatives, where Congress representatives on both sides of the aisle have voted to overturn the tariffs, specifically with regards to Canada. And it is weakening in terms of the economic impact that they were intended to have, both in terms of the trade surplus numbers, the jobs numbers, as well as the inflation numbers. So, yes, I do think it is important that we continue to demonstrate patience, and timing is everything. You are right. My panelists are right. But we got to make sure we get the right deal.
Mm-hmm. And Tony, add to that the U.S. Court of International Trade ruling businesses are owed refunds. So do you think that that is all basically setting up in our favor for Dominic LeBlanc's sort of opening? It's not going to be his first meeting, but this next meeting. And do you think he can go in there with a bit more of a sort of puffed out chest?
Let me say a couple things. First of all, this is a tariff president. That's not going to change. So if one aspect of tariffs changes, he'll find another way to do tariffs. I don't think we should get ourselves wrapped up in what federal court has said what about aspects of the tariff battle. That's going to continue on for years. Don't forget, Joe Biden did a bunch of tariffs in his day, and whoever succeeds, Donald Trump is going to do tariffs in their day. Tariffs are a fact of life. I guess I'm the one person on this panel who's advising urgency. I really think that Canadians have to understand that there's a cost to not having a new deal with the Americans. Yeah, I know we have CUSMA, et cetera, but Trump is ignoring CUSMA. So how much of a deal is that? The fact of the matter is this economy cannot last unless there is certainty with the Canada-US trade relationship. There is capital flight happening right now, and it is only accelerating in this country. We are getting poorer by the week. So I really hope that we can find a way to get the issues on the table. Christie has delineated those right now. Get those issues on the table. Start to have serious conversation and get to a better place. I think our economy needs it. I know it's tough for Canadians. They want to jam Trump. I get that. I really do. I get that. But I think if we want to look soberly at the long-term costs for our economy, there really has to be a deal. I would say sooner rather than later. I'm not saying next week or next month, but that process has to start.
I respect you, Tony. Obviously, I just would fact check that this last year we had a record amount of foreign direct investment in Canada. So I do think that there is capital that is coming into this country, and I think that is one of the wins in our sails that we have to continue to use to press this file forward.
If only our pension funds were investing.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it on that. I appreciate all of you, Christy Clark, Monty Solberg, Tony Clement, and Marco Mendicino. Appreciate you being on today's Front Bench. We're going to take a quick commercial break. After that, though, pollster Nick Nanos, he's going to be here to break down his latest data, which shows that the Liberals have opened up an 11-point advantage over the Conservatives. What's behind that new lead? He'll explain right after this. Welcome back to Power Play. Well, the political landscape in Canada continues to shift. Many polls right across this country showing the Liberals with a very healthy lead over the Conservatives, a significant gap, especially compared to what it was in April's federal election. That was just under a year ago. New polling from Nanos Research shows that the Liberals have opened up an 11-point advantage over the Conservatives right now. Here to break down the latest data is Nick Nanos. He is the founder and chief data scientist at Nanos Research. Thank you very much for being there in D.C. Nick, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks, Mike. How you doing?
Good, thanks. So this is the biggest lead that the Liberals have had in months. What is behind it?
I think it's a combination of factors. And, the thing is as you mentioned, it's been fairly a tight race until about 3 or 4 weeks ago. It was within the margin of error. But what we've seen is a combination of factors that have not helped Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives. First of all, the third defection cannot be good news for Pierre Poilievre because that captures the attention of Canadians and they're wondering what's going on with the Conservative caucus and what's going on with Pierre Poilievre's leadership, especially after he just came off a whopping win and a resounding kind of vote when it came to his party. So that's a big question mark. The other thing is that I don't think we can underestimate the relentless pace that Mark Carney has had internationally trying to kind of put together a series of trade agreements and to kind of build an economy that's a little more resilient. You roll up all those things, and what we're seeing on the ballot support at least, that the Liberals, which were in a statistical tie with the Conservatives, now pulling out to ahead by about 11 percentage points.
Pushing even further on that vein of Carney doing well, in terms of preferred prime minister, he's at 56%, Pierre Poilievre at 22.2%. He's got a 31-point lead right now. When you consider all of this, how do you think that this plays into any kind of rumors about a potential election coming?
Well, I think if you happen to be a supporter of the Liberals, you're looking at numbers like this and wondering whether they should be calling a snap election. And if you're conservatives, you're probably looking at trying to delay things. The fact of the matter is that when we look at that advantage on the preferred prime minister front that Mark Carney has over Pierre Poilievre, this is the widest advantage that he's had, ever over Pierre Poilievre. And in another context, think of it this way, Mike. Pierre Poilievre is trailing his party in the double digits. Mark Carney is ahead of his party in double digits. So on the leadership front, there's a lot of political coattails that Mark Carney currently has, while at the same time for Pierre Poilievre, there's no political coattail right now in terms of his leadership and its impact on Conservative support, because there are more people that are opting for the blue team than are opting for Pierre Poilievre right now.
Okay, we have just about a minute left and maybe no general election coming up, but we do know that there will likely have to be some by-elections that the Prime Minister has to call in 3 ridings. How does this set up the Liberal for those votes?
Well, you know, the thing is that whenever a party is ahead in the public opinion polls, that's usually good news for them in the by-elections. You know, the thing is when Pierre Poilievre, prior to the last federal election, was riding high, that's when they picked up ridings like St. Paul's. It's because there was a lot of enthusiasm about Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, and a lot of people were quite negative about Justin Trudeau. Now the shoe's on the other foot. Right now, at least, Carney's brand is strong. The Liberals are ahead. That's probably going to put wind in the sails for the Liberals in these upcoming by-elections. But, you know, even when we talk about by-elections and when we talk about a potential federal election, these are still wild cards. Nothing is determined. This is just based on the numbers today. We should not be projecting them into the future because, remember, Mike, we were talking about Pierre Poilievre winning a stunning victory or being able to win a big victory just, you know, not this January, the January before.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, Nick. Nick Nanos from Nanos Research, thanks so much for doing this. We appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Time for one more commercial break. Our takeaways next, so stay right there. And that is your Power Play Day in Politics. Thanks so much for sharing your time with us. I'm Mike LeCouture. I'll be back here tomorrow, but stay tuned because today's top headlines are just ahead.